following video deals with mature subject matter which may not be suitable for younger children. Viewer discretion is advised.
Last week, on July 4th, 2023, the action film Sound of Freedom premiered worldwide under the distribution of Angel Studios after spending 6 years on the back burners of 20th Century Fox and Disney. This movie is based on the career of Tim Ballard, a former special agent for America's Department of Homeland Security, who has spent a decade rescuing children from the dark underworld of the sex trafficking industry through his non-profit organization, Operation Underground Railroad. Ballard is played by American actor Jim Caviezel, star of the films The Thin Red Line, The Count of Monte Cristo, and The Passion of the Christ, who has attracted media attention in recent years for his statements that trafficked children are sometimes tortured so that adrenochrome might be extracted from their bodies, adrenochrome being a natural chemical produced by the oxidation of the hormone epinephrine or adrenaline. Caviezel, who claims to have gleaned this information from the anti-trafficking agency consulted while working on The Sound of Freedom, first mentioned what he called the adrenochroming of children in 2021, while remotely promoting the film at a health freedom conference in the city of Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. He elaborated on this alleged practice more recently in an interview with former White House chief strategist Steve Bannon, describing adrenochrome as an elite drug that they've used for many years. It's 10 times more potent than heroin, and it has some mystical qualities as far as making you look younger. Ambrosia is the street term, well, the elite term. Ballard himself touched on the underground adrenochrome industry in a recent viral interview with Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson. "They're taking children's blood and devouring it," Ballard said, referring to human trafficking clients in West Africa. "It's very real, this witch doctory. They take these children, they take their organs, they take their blood, they drink it." The notion that fresh, naturally derived human adrenochrome is a potent narcotic in high demand on the black market, particularly among certain elitist circles, far predates Ballard and Caviezel's recent statements, having circulated throughout the shadowy corners of the internet for decades. Adrenochrome, as mentioned, is a derivative of the fight-or-flight hormone adrenaline, normally produced in the adrenal glands above the kidneys in response to perceived danger. When subjected to extreme stress, the body floods the bloodstream with adrenaline, causing an increase in heart and respiratory rate, and providing muscles with the energy they need to contract quickly and powerfully. When subjected to extreme anxiety, the body suffers what biologists call oxidative stress, during which the body produces negatively charged oxidants like superoxide. During physical torture, the body produces an excess of both adrenaline and oxidants, which interact with each other to form the chemical compound adrenochrome. Predictably, various mainstream media outlets have dismissed the notion of an underground adrenochrome industry as a baseless, right-wing fantasy. In his July 31st, 2020 article for the website Wired.com, for example, Harvard ethnographer Brian Friedberg characterized the concept of adrenochrome harvesting as a modern incarnation of a centuries-old anti-Semitic myth. This supposed urban fairy tale, other writers have proposed, has its roots in journalist Hunter S. Thompson's 1971 novel, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Thompson's book is based on the author's own trips to Sin City with Hispanic attorney Oscar Zeta Acosta. About halfway through the novel, Acosta's character hands Thompson's character a little brown bottle of adrenochrome, which he claims to have obtained from a Satanist accused of child molestation. "He offered me human blood," he said of the dealer. "Said it would make me higher than I'd ever been in my life. I thought he was kidding, so I told him I'd just as soon have an ounce or so of pure adrenochrome. Of the substance itself," he said, "that stuff makes pure mescaline seem like ginger beer. You'll go completely crazy if you take too much. There's only one source for this stuff, the adrenal glands from a living human body. It's no good if you get it out of a corpse." In reality, skeptics argue, adrenochrome is a relatively mundane and not very exciting chemical compound, with little value as a narcotic, which can be easily and inexpensively synthesized in a lab. Some have even made the erroneous claim that it cannot be found in human blood, or that it doesn't exist at all. While synthetic crystalline adrenochrome can indeed be cheaply produced, as it has been for laboratory purposes since 1958, The idea that the substance in its fresh, natural form is not an extremely potent hallucinogen flies in the face of human experiments conducted in the 1950s in an unassuming corner of the Canadian province of Saskatchewan, and in the longevity of a brutal native custom once practiced by the First Nations of the Great Lakes. In this piece, we will explore Canada's shocking role in the dark history of adrenochrome consumption. Before we delve into the fascinating story of Drs. Hoffer, Osmond, and Smithies, Saskatchewan-based pioneers in the medical application of psychoactive drugs, who theorized that schizophrenia is caused by the inability to metabolize adrenochrome in the brain, who personally explored the psychedelic potential of adrenochrome through self-experimentation, let us first take a look at a historic phenomenon which may constitute the first recorded instances of adrenochrome consumption in Canada. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, missionaries, explorers, soldiers, and fur traders who plied their trade in eastern Canada described a grisly, martial ritual practiced by certain First Nations warriors of what is now Ontario and Quebec. In the aftermath of a victorious battle, or at the fatal conclusion of the ritual torture of an enemy prisoner, native braves would eat the flesh and drink the blood of their fallen enemies, believing that such ingestion allowed them to absorb the power of the slain. This horrific custom was practiced by the Iroquois, a confederacy of 5 nations native to the forests of upstate New York, whose ruthless warriors, allied with the Dutch and English settlers of what is now the northeastern United States, were the terror of 17th century New France. The Iroquois' proclivity for consuming the corpses of their enemies is alluded to several times in the Jesuit relations, reports made by French Jesuit missionaries to their superiors, describing their attempts to convert the natives of New France to Christianity. For example, in a 1632 relation, Jesuit father Paul Lejeune, who lived among the Montagnais of Quebec at the time, described how the Iroquois made their prisoners of war suffer all that cruelty as the devil can suggest. At last, as a final horror, they eat and devour them almost raw. In 1637, Lejeune detailed the torture, execution, and cannibalism of an Iroquois prisoner captured by the Huron, another Algonquian people native to the Great Lakes. After tying him to a tree, the Huron captors burned their prisoner with torches and red-hot tomahawks until his entire body was scorched, going so far as to melt his eyes and thrust burning brands down his throat. When the prisoner became too exhausted to recoil from their implements, the captors dismembered him alive and feasted on his corpse. Perhaps the most famous record of Iroquois torture and cannibalism is the second-hand account of the martyrdom of Father Jean de Brebeuf, Canada's patron saint, which appears in the 1649 issue of the Jesuit Relations. Jean de Brebeuf was a French Jesuit missionary who ministered to the spiritual needs of the Huron Indians between Lakes Ontario and Huron. In 1647, the Hurons' hereditary enemies, the Mohawk and Seneca of the Iroquois Confederacy, launched what would become a massive 9-year offensive against France's native allies in the Great Lakes. On March 16, 1649, Brebeuf and his assistant, Father Gabriel Lallemand, were caught in the crossfire of this so-called Beaver War, when the Iroquois captured the village in which they had established their mission and carried them off the Georgian Bay. On the shores of that great lake, as historian René Latourelle put it, they suffered one of the most atrocious martyrdoms in the annals of Christianity. Brebeuf's fate was recorded by his fellow Jesuit, Christophe Regnault, who learned the details of his last moments from some wounded Huron warriors who escaped their Iroquois captors and sought refuge in his cabin. The Huron fugitives described how the Iroquois had stripped the priest naked and tied him to a post before torturing him. First, they tore out his fingernails. Next, they beat every inch of his body with clubs. One member of Brebeuf's old Huron congregation, who had been captured by the Iroquois in an earlier raid and absorbed into the tribe, poured a kettle of boiling water on the Jesuit's head in mockery of the sacrament of baptism. The Iroquois then adorned Brebeuf with a necklace consisting of red-hot tomahawk heads strung together, and with a bark belt saturated with resin, which they set on fire. During all these torments, Regnault's informants told him, Father de Brebeuf endured like a rock, insensible to fire and flames, which astonished all the bloodthirsty wretches who tormented him. His zeal was so great that he preached continually to these infidels to try to convert them. His executioners were enraged against him for constantly speaking to them of God and of their conversion. To prevent him from speaking more, they cut off his tongue, and both his upper and lower lips. After that, they set themselves to strip the flesh from his legs, thighs, and arms, to the very bone, and then put it to roast before his eyes in order to eat it. Those butchers, seeing that the good father began to grow weak, made him sit down on the ground, and one of them, taking a knife, cut off the skin covering his skull. Another one of those barbarians, seeing that the good father would soon die, made an opening in the upper part of his chest and tore out his heart, which he roasted and ate. Others came to drink his blood, still warm, which they drank with both hands, saying that Father de Brebeuf had been very courageous to endure as much pain as they had given him, and that, by drinking his blood, they would become courageous like him. The Iroquois offensive in which Jean de Brebeuf lost his life resulted in the displacement of the Huron, as well as the virtual destruction of the Neutral, Petun, and Erie nations, all allies of the French. After a ferocious French counterattack throughout the first half of the 1660s, the Iroquois entered into a shaky truce with the settlers of New France and established villages throughout the territories of their vanquished native enemies. In 1669, 20 years after the martyrdom of Jean de Brebeuf, two parties of French explorers set out together in search of the Ohio River. One of the groups was captained by René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, an adventurer who would later establish the French colony of Louisiana, who at the time hoped that the Ohio River might constitute the legendary Northwest Passage. The other party was a company of Sulpician missionaries, led by François Delier de Casson, a French cavalry officer turned priest, who hoped to convert the natives of the Ohio River to the Catholic faith. The joint company embarked at La Salle's seigneury of Lachine, on the island of Montreal, and traveled by canoe up the St. Lawrence River and along the southern shores of Lake Ontario. At what is probably Irondequoit Bay, they came upon a Seneca Iroquois village, whose inhabitants invited them to stay the night. Unfortunately for the Frenchmen, the evening's entertainment consisted of the ritual torture and execution of a prisoner of war from the West, a well-built warrior in his late teens or early 20s. Casson's traveling companion and fellow Sulpician missionary, René de Brehon de Galinée, described the atrocity in his journal, Exploration of the Great Lakes, 1669 to 1670. For 6 hours, the Iroquois seared the prisoner from head to toe with a red-hot musket barrel, beginning with the soles of his feet. When he was sufficiently roasted, they forced him to run a gauntlet through the village, prodding him with lit torches and showering him with hot coals all the while. At length, Galinée wrote, after 2 hours of this barbarous diversion, they knocked him down with a stone, and throwing themselves upon him, cut his body in pieces. One carried off his head, another an arm, a third some other member, which they put in a pot for the feast. Many offered some to the Frenchmen, telling them there was nothing in the world better to eat, but no one desired to try the experiment. There are other tales of Iroquois torture and cannibalism, which appear in the letters and memoirs of the inhabitants of New France. In 1680, for example, while exploring the Mississippi River, La Salle and his companions came across the remains of hundreds of Illinois women and children, whom Iroquois warriors had tortured to death in a field. Most of the victims had been mutilated and partially eaten. In the summer of 1689, after hostilities resumed between the Iroquois and the French, Mohawk warriors attacked the French settlement of Lachine, which had developed around La Salle's old seigneury, and massacred its inhabitants. The warriors reputedly roasted and ate the settlement's children, including, according to some reports, a handful of preborn infants, whom they cut out of their mothers' wombs. Since there are no 17th century Iroquois warriors around today who might justify their people's practice of torturing and cannibalizing their enemies, we can only speculate as to the reason for this fiendish cultural quirk. Perhaps their barbaric rituals were simply expressions of supreme victory over their vanquished foes, the acts of torture and cannibalism being the most complete forms of control one warrior can exert over another. Perhaps, as historian George Franklin Feldman suggested in his 2008 book, Cannibalism, Headhunting, and Human Sacrifice in North America, A Forgotten History, citing a passage from one of Lejeune's relations, the Iroquois believed they were commanded to torture and eat their enemies by the deity they worshipped, the implacable sun god. Or perhaps, as Regnault's pitiable description of Brebeuf's martyrdom seems to imply, the Iroquois hoped to acquire their enemies' bravery through the consumption of their tortured flesh and blood. a notion that could only have been bolstered by the powerful psychological effects of adrenochrome, which Iroquois torturer executioners would surely have ingested in copious quantities. The Iroquois and Huron were not the only First Nations to traditionally torture and eat their prisoners. In the forests north of Iroquoian territory, and around the upper Great Lakes to the west, lay the traditional homeland of various Algonquian or Anishinaabe nations, like the Ojibwe and Ottawa. Although these people generally abhorred the idea of cannibalism as a means of survival during the cold winter months and in times of famine, associating such anthropophagy with an evil spirit called the Wendigo, some of them were not averse to drinking the lifeblood and feasting on the flesh of enemy warriors defeated in battle. One early report of martial cannibalism among the Ojibwe appears in the French-language book Memoir on the Manners, Customs, and Religion of the Savages of North America, written by French explorer and fur trader Nicolas Perrault, sometime in the late 17th or early 18th century. Perrault described how, in 1662, about 100 Iroquois warriors entered Ojibwe country at Sault Ste. Marie, between Lakes Huron and Superior, to look for a village to eat, as they have always taken pleasure in drinking the blood and eating the flesh of all the different tribes. Before launching their planned assault, these invaders were perceived by Ojibwe scouts, who brought word of their presence back to their band. The Ojibwe hastily assembled their own war party and ambushed the unsuspecting Iroquois at daybreak, at a place known today as Iroquois Point. The skirmish that ensued was a complete victory for the Ojibwe, who slew every last one of their southern foes with arrows and war clubs. The would-be cannibals met the same fate they had planned to deal to the natives of Lake Superior. The Iroquois who had been sent out as scouts, Perrault wrote, returned to their camp a few days after this defeat, expecting to join their people there. But when they found only headless corpses on the ground, and the bones of those whose flesh had been eaten, they made diligent haste to carry back to their own country this dismal news. Other documented cases of Anishinaabe cannibalism occurred during the 7 Years' War, a global conflict fought between France and Britain and their respective allies from 1756 to 1763, and in a smaller succeeding conflict known as Pontiac's Rebellion. We will explore one of the better written accounts to come out of the second conflict. The 7 Years' War resulted in British control over nearly all of eastern continental North America, from as far north as Hudson's Bay to as far south as New Orleans. In the aftermath of this World War, British soldiers began to garrison themselves in the old French fur trading forts established throughout the Great Lakes. They were followed by independent British and colonial American fur traders, called peddlers, who hoped to open up trading relationships with the native allies of the defeated French. Among the first of these peddlers was a New Jersey-born adventurer, known today as Alexander Henry the Elder, who recorded his Canadian escapades in his 1809 memoir. The Anishinaabe had no great love for the British, whom they had actively fought against during the late war. In comparison with their erstwhile French trading partners, who lavished gifts upon them at the commencement of trading sessions, and regularly married their sisters and daughters, the British seemed cool and condescending. On the orders of their general Geoffrey Amherst, who feared an Indian uprising, they also sold the natives less gunpowder and lead than they had grown accustomed to using. Unwilling to tolerate the subtle insults of these haughty red-coated conquerors, a handful of Anishinaabe nations rallied around an Ottawa war chief named Pontiac and attempted to violently drive the British out of their territory, sparking a 3-year war known as Pontiac's Rebellion. On June 4th, 1763, at the outbreak of this conflict, Alexander Henry the Elder was trading at Fort Michilimackinac, at the northern tip of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where a company of British soldiers had just taken up residence. Unbeknownst to the British, a local Ojibwe band had secretly decided to participate in Pontiac's Rebellion, and concocted a brilliant plan to take the fort by surprise. In honor of King George III's birthday, the Ojibwe proposed to play a game of lacrosse with a visiting band of Sauk Indians just outside the fort, and invited the soldiers to watch. In the midst of the game, an Ojibwe player lobbed the lacrosse ball over the fort's walls, prompting the entire team to stampede through the fort's open gate. As they entered the complex, The players seized knives and tomahawks from the Ojibwe women who had inconspicuously stationed themselves at the gate, concealing the weapons beneath wool blankets, and proceeded to slaughter the unsuspecting Englishmen therein. Henry was writing a letter in his cabin when a cacophony of Indian war cries erupted outside, marking the commencement of the attack. "Going instantly to my window," he wrote, "I saw a crowd of Indians within the fort, furiously cutting down and scalping every Englishman they found." Henry seized a flintlock shotgun and contemplated stepping outside to help his fellow countrymen, but quickly realized that to do so would be suicidal. Observing that the Ojibwe were not harming any of the French-Canadian residents of the fort, Henry sought refuge in the cabin of one of his Gallic neighbors and found a hiding place in the attic. Through a crack in the wall, he watched the Ojibwe warriors go about their grisly work. "The dead were scalped and mangled," he wrote. "The dying were writhing and shrieking under the unsatiated knife and tomahawk, and from the bodies of some, ripped open, the butchers were drinking the blood, scooped up in the hollow of joined hands, and quaffed amid shouts of rage and victory." The day after the massacre, the owners of the cabin in which Henry had taken refuge handed him over to the Ojibwe. Instead of slaughtering him in cold blood, as some of the more hot-headed warriors expressed a desire to do, the Ojibwe chiefs shackled Henry with a handful of prisoners who had been spared the butchery of the previous day. Several days later, Henry was freed by an Ojibwe sub-chief whom he had befriended prior to the massacre. This intervention likely saved Henry's life. On the morning following his release, another Ojibwe chief, who was absent at the time of the massacre, arrived in camp and personally slaughtered 7 of the English captives with his knife in order to demonstrate his support for his countrymen's actions. The Indians dismembered the fattest of these prisoners, cooked his corpse in 5 kettles outside the lodge in which the prisoners were housed, and devoured him. Henry's friend and rescuer was invited to attend the ghastly feast, and returned to his lodge with a dish containing a human hand and a large piece of flesh. He did not appear to relish the repast, Henry wrote, but told me that it was then, and always had been the custom among all the Indian nations, when returning from war, or on overcoming their enemies, to make a war feast from among the slain. This, he said, inspired the warrior with courage in attack, and bred him to meet death with fearlessness. With the possible exception of several cannibalistic killing sprees in the 1800s, which the Cree of Western Canada attributed to the diabolical influence of the aforementioned Wendigo, and a handful of war crimes committed during the Northwest Rebellion of 1885, the practice of drinking adrenochrome-rich blood seems to have died out in Canada with the Indian Wars of the 18th century. Canadian consumption of the chemical compound resumed in the mid-20th century, albeit on a much smaller scale, and in a manner far less appalling than its martial precursor. Since at least 1856, scientists have observed that fluids extracted from the adrenal medulla, the section of the adrenal gland which produces adrenaline, turn pink with prolonged exposure to atmospheric oxygen. In 1935, scientists crystallized this substance and dubbed it adrenochrome, a word which means colored adrenaline. By 1942, adrenochrome was being considered as a potential remedy for high blood pressure. Anecdotal evidence described in one academic paper suggests that, during World War II, Canadian field medics who found themselves short on morphine would sometimes extract adrenaline from the adrenal glands of deceased soldiers, allow it to degrade in the open air, and inject its pink derivative into the veins of the wounded. In addition to producing an anesthetic effect, this substance gave the soldiers to which it was administered vivid hallucinations. In 1952, 3 pioneering scientists based in the Canadian Prairie province of Saskatchewan took the world of psychiatry by storm by proposing a biochemical cause for schizophrenia, formulating a hypothesis which, upon further development, would come to revolve around adrenochrome. These scientists were Dr. Abram Hoffer, a Saskatchewan-born biochemist, Humphrey Fortescue Osmond, an English-born psychiatrist, and John Raymond Smithies, an India-born neuroscientist. At the time, both Smithies and Osmond worked at the sprawling Weyburn Mental Hospital in the town of Weyburn, Saskatchewan, a nightmarish institution which we explored in a previous piece, where they experimented on mental patients by administering them high doses of the psychedelic drugs mescaline and LSD. In their paper, Schizophrenia, A New Approach, Hoffer, Osmond, and Smithies noted the striking molecular similarity between adrenaline and mescaline. Knowing from human experimentation and personal experience that consumption of mescaline produced a change in perception mirroring that of schizophrenia, they proposed that the latter disease was caused by self-intoxication, resultant of the body's inability to metabolize some hypothetical substance which the body naturally produces, a sort of intermediate between mescaline and adrenaline, which they called Substance M. The scientists later identified this chemical as adrenochrome. In a later reminiscence, Hoffer recalled the occasion on which he and his colleagues first considered adrenochrome as a potential candidate for their mystery substance. Their eureka moment took place in a small room at the back of a medical library in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, following the very first meeting of the Saskatchewan Committee on Schizophrenia Research. After I had finished my talk, he wrote, Dr. D. Hutchin asked us if we would like to know what that pink stuff was in deteriorated adrenaline. We were electrified at his question. He told us it was adrenochrome. He was probably the only scientist in Canada who knew what it was. He had done research for his PhD with his compound, in England with Professor Burns. Suddenly, we had our adrenochrome hypothesis. Before we delve into Drs. Hoffer, Osmond, and Smithies' disturbing research into the psychedelic effects of adrenochrome, it might be worth our while to touch on the dark story of the Weyburn Mental Hospital and Dr. Osmond's strange connections with Aldous Huxley and the CIA, connections made doubly disconcerting by the proposed association between America's three-letter agencies and the adrenochrome harvesting industry, insinuated by Caviezel and others. Humphrey Osmond's LSD experiments in the Weyburn Hospital attracted the interest of Aldous Huxley, the British novelist whose 1932 novel, Brave New World, depicts a future dystopia in which a small oligarchy enslaves the masses through the chemical manipulation of their passions, whose brother, Sir Julian Huxley, developed the chilling philosophy of transhumanism, which so many members of today's Western elite openly espouse. In May 1953, Osmond supplied Huxley with mescaline and supervised his ensuing psychedelic trip at his home in the Hollywood Hills. Huxley's experience made him a wholehearted advocate of hallucinogenic drugs and prompted him to write his famous essay, The Doors of Perception, in which he professed his opinions on the subject. In that piece, Huxley referenced Osmond, Hoffer, and Smithies' hypothesis regarding the relationship between schizophrenia and adrenochrome. Osmond's work with LSD also drew the attention of the Central Intelligence Agency, which hoped to employ psychedelic drugs for purposes of coercion. 1 month before Huxley's mescaline trip in California, the CIA, aided by information they acquired from Dr. Osmond at the Weyburn Mental Hospital, launched Project MK-Ultra, a clandestine human experimentation program in which hallucinations and psychiatric mind control techniques were applied to unsuspecting test subjects. Throughout the 1950s, Osmond, Hoffer, and Smithies plunged headlong into the fascinating world of adrenochrome, taking a special interest in its effect on human behavior. First, they manufactured the drug themselves, creating what Hoffer described as beautiful crystals which were purplish red, which formed a bright red solution, which turned yellow when oxidized by the oxygen in the air. They then began to experiment on themselves and their wives by injecting the adrenochrome solution beneath their skin and directly into their veins. Their ensuing experiences led them to describe adrenochrome as a more insidious and longer-lasting drug than both mescaline and LSD. Osmond wrote a detailed description of his first trip on adrenochrome inside the Weyburn Mental Hospital. A 30-hour ordeal resulted of an intravenous injection of what he described as a very small dose. After the purple-red liquid was injected into my right forearm, Osmond wrote, I had a good deal of pain. I did not expect that the experimenters would get any results from a preliminary trial, and so was not, as far as I can judge, in a state of heightened expectancy. After about 10 minutes, while I was lying on a couch looking up at the ceiling, I found that it had changed color. It seemed that the lighting had become brighter. I looked across the room, and it seemed to have changed in some not easily definable way. I closed my eyes, and a brightly colored pattern of dots appeared. The dots were not as brilliant as those which I have seen under mescal, but were of the same shape. The patterns of dots gradually resolved into fish-like shapes. I felt that I was on the bottom of the sea, or in an aquarium among a shoal of brilliant fishes. At one moment, I concluded that I was a sea anemone in this pond. Abram Hoffer and a psychologist named Neil Agnew who were supervising his trip and recording his reactions, then showed Osmond a reproduction of a self-portrait of the artist Vincent van Gogh. "I have never seen a picture so plastic and alive," Osmond wrote. Van Gogh gazed at me from the paper, crop-headed, with hurt, mad eyes, and seemed to be three-dimensional. I felt that I could stroke the cloth of his coat, and that he might turn around in his frame. Osmond continued to trip as his observers brought him out of the hospital to Hoffer's home, finding something sinister and mysterious about the cracks in the hospital floor, and marveling at the grace and brilliance of a lamp he glimpsed through the window of a house they passed in the street. Next morning, Osmond concluded, although I had only slept a few hours, life seemed good. Colors were bright, and my appetite keen. I was completely aware of the possibilities arising from the experiment. Color had extra meaning for me. Voices, typewriting, any sound was very clear. With those whom I felt did not appreciate the importance of the new discovery, I could easily have become irritable, but I was able to control myself. Later, Osmond took a second, larger 5 mg dose of adrenochrome and recorded his experiences. At first, his vision seemed sharper, and as before, the Van Gogh portrait appeared to be three-dimensional. As the day drew on, Osmond felt a disturbing lack of empathy creep into his psyche. "My sister telephoned me," he wrote, "and although I am usually glad to hear her voice, I couldn't feel any warmth or happiness. I watched a group of patients dancing, and although I enjoy watching dancing with the envious interest of one who is clumsy on his feet, I didn't have a flicker of feeling." As we drove back to Abe's house, a pedestrian walked across the road in front of us. I thought we might run him down, and I noticed with detached curiosity. I had no concern for the victim. We did not knock him down. I began to wonder whether I was a person anymore, and to think that I might be a plant or a stone. As my feeling for these inanimate objects increased, my feeling for and my interest in humans diminished. I felt indifferent towards humans, and had to curb myself from making unpleasant remarks about them. Hoffer's observations corroborate Osmond's self-report. On the occasion of Osmond's second trial, he wrote, "The most noticeable change was his withdrawal from people. After the laboratory session, we drove to my home. Osmond entered, found a chair, where he sat for approximately 1 hour, intently examining the rug. He did not greet the group of people who were at the house, nor enter into the discussion." Osmond awoke the next morning feeling lively and well-rested, and prepared to head to a scientific meeting. He took 2 hours to get dressed. After finding his vehicle in the building's parking lot, with some difficulty, he found himself incapable of driving, and asked the garage proprietor to drive him to work, feeling none of the shame which such a request would normally have induced. "Abe," he wrote Hoffer, scrawling a note in the middle of the meeting, "this damn stuff is still working. The odd thing is that stress brings it on after about 15 minutes. I have this glass wall other side of the barrier feeling. I have a feeling that I don't know anyone here. Absurd but unpleasant. Also some slight ideas of reference arising from my sensation of oddness. I have just begun to wonder if my hands are writing this. Crazy, of course." Following Hoffer and Osmond's preliminary self-experiments, other scientists began administering adrenochrome to spiders, mice, rats, cats, dogs, rabbits, monkeys, and human beings. The drugs were administered intravenously, subcutaneously, by placing them beneath the tongue, by inhaling them, and in one instance, by injecting them directly into the brain. In every case, adrenochrome produced profound psychological changes in the subjects. In a Russian experiment, trained monkeys injected with adrenochrome were unable to complete simple tasks they had performed many times before, even when they were hungry and bananas were on the line. In a Canadian study, rats injected with the substance memorized patterns far more slowly than normal rats. And in an American study, in which adrenochrome was injected into the brains of cats, the feline subjects all slipped into a deep, blissful trance. They would sometimes suddenly look up towards the ceiling or around them, the authors wrote, and then remain motionless, staring into space. After an initial gradual reduction in motor activity, the cats would finally sit in odd positions, with their eyes wide open for long periods, and howl. Other observable effects included mild anesthesia, the spontaneous assumption of bizarre postures, and unnaturally high libido, which in one instance resulted in a doped-out tomcat making amorous overtures to the laboratory dog. The scientists, who injected other cats with LSD and mescaline, observed that adrenochrome had a more powerful and longer-lasting effect on the subject's brainwaves than either of the other hallucinogens. Despite the frantic attempts of the mainstream media to place adrenochrome in the same camp as the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy, this brief glimpse into the chemical's place in Canadian history proves without a doubt that this so-called pink adrenaline is an extremely potent narcotic, and strongly suggests that it has been consumed as a fortifying elixir for centuries. Whether or not there is a black market adrenochrome industry, in which trafficked human victims are subjected to prolonged torture in order to fulfill a vampiric elitist demand, is a question that only time can answer.